evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's lecture. Our speaker, Nick Higham, is a journalist, author, speaker, and former BBC News correspondent. He began his broadcasting career in 1978, when he joined the BBC as its first media correspondent, before his role then expanded to include the arts as well as media. And then he became an analyst for BBC News 24. In 2007, he became a wider correspondent for BBC News. And he was also the presenter of Meet the Author on the BBC News channel. Nick lives in North London, in Stoke Newington, and it was the New River, or the absence of the New River, on the borders of Islington and Clerkenwell, which first sparked his interest in London's water. His book, The Mercenary River, Private Greed, Public Greed, A History of London Water, is his first book and the subject of his talk tonight. It has been widely praised, the first biography of liquid London. It has been painstakingly researched, and, writes Ian Sinclair, it's a story told with cracking momentum. Simon Jenkins described it as an enthralling guide to London's most neglected and underexploited asset. And Andrew Marr praised it as a thoroughly original and gripping book. Anyone interested in the real London needs to read this. We have copies for sale afterwards, lots of them. But first of all, please join me in welcoming Nick Higham.
Hilary, thank you very much indeed. Good evening. I apologise. I've come on stage with a glass of water, which I think is quite common among speakers. I've also come on stage with a glass of wine. Normally, I have an iron rule to take no alcohol ahead of any kind of speaking or talking, but I have a really irritating cough. It's irritating to me, and it's irritating, or will be if it goes on, probably be very irritating to you, and I am trying an experiment. My sister gave me a very strong gin and tonic the other night, and the cough miraculously disappeared for an hour or two. So I'm hoping a little bit of Highgate Literary and Scientific Institution white wine may do the trick as well. I think we probably need to have the lights down, don't we? Because that way you will see the screen better. As Hilary said, what I'm going to talk about this evening is based on my book, The Mercenary River, which has this rather splendid cover devised by my publishers. If you look at the cover and you look at the title, you might assume that it is a book about the River Thames. And I can see why you might think that, but I'm afraid you would be wrong. It is not about the River Thames. There are lots of good books about the River Thames. This is not one of them. It is a book about something rather different, something nobody has actually written a comprehensive history of before, and that is London's water supply. But if you put a history of London's water supply on the front cover of a book, I can guarantee nobody will buy it. So we have engaged in a little bit of subterfuge. You would expect me to say this, but I find water supply, the history of water supply, absolutely fascinating. People assume it's going to be boring. They assume it's all about pipes and pumps and so on, and rather dull. What they don't realise is that if you are looking at a big city like London over 400 or 500 years, a city which grew immensely fast, a city which needed water. Without water, there is no city. The story of how that water reached people is an extraordinarily complex one, which brings in politics, which brings in the history of business, which is social history, the history of science, and researching the book took me down an enormous number of, to me at any rate, absolutely fascinating rabbit holes. Most of the research got into the book, quite a lot didn't. Quite a lot of it, most of it, I'm afraid, will not get into this talk. There is simply too much in the book. So, I am not, for instance, going to talk this evening about fraudulent accounting in Victorian business, though there is a chapter on that in the book. I'm not going to talk about the history of local government in London and its importance to the water industry, though there is also a chapter about that in the book. I am not going to talk about what one London water company did in the 1860s when it was told quite correctly that its product was literally killing its customers. If you want to know about that, you're going to have to buy the book, and as Hilary said, there are copies available for sale afterwards. I'm not going to talk about why one London water company deliberately cut off thousands of customers in the 1870s, even though it knew they had no alternative source of water and would not have for some time to come. You want to know about that? You're going to have to buy the book. So, if I'm not talking about those things, what am I talking about? Well, that's one of them, one of the things I'm talking about. That is, Hilary's already mentioned it, the New River, which is neither new nor a river. It's not a river because it's an aqueduct which was built, dug, created to bring fresh water originally from springs in Hertfordshire to the City of London. And it's not new because it was completed more than 400 years ago in 1613. And remarkably, it is still a fully functioning part of London's water supply. 10% of London's water comes down the New River every day and then is taken off to a water treatment works in a place called Coppermills near Walthamstow. These days, it doesn't start at springs. It starts at the River Lee, about halfway between the towns of Hertford and Ware. If you walk along the towpath of the Lee navigation, you'll reach this building, which was built in the 1850s. It's called New Gauge. Every day, a maximum of 22.5 million gallons of water comes out of that aperture at the bottom and flows into the New River, which then meanders. Originally it meandered about 41 miles across what is now North London to a terminus between Islington and Clerkenwell. These days it is rather shorter. One reason why the New River is interesting is because of the man who built it. He was called Hugh Middleton. There is a statue to him on Islington Green, rather weathered and eroded statue. And there's another one on one of the four corners of Holborn Viaduct, and there is a third on the Royal Exchange building immediately across the road from the Bank of England, and yet another in the foyer of the Town Hall in Islington. And Middleton was a London goldsmith, which means that he was the sort of nearest early modern equivalent of a banker, because goldsmiths had money. They had access to lots of ready cash. And although he didn't dream up the idea of the New River, Middleton made it happen. He raised the money, he oversaw the construction, and he founded something called the New River Company, of which he was the governor. And one reason why and I should say that he was highly regarded by his contemporaries. He became, in due course, a baronet, entitled to call himself Sir Hugh, and passed the title on to his heirs. And very unusually, he was not required to pay for the title. James I had invented the title of baronet basically as a money-making wheeze. You paid him money, you got to call yourself Sir. Hugh Middleton, this is a mark of how widely respected he was, got the title for free. Forgive me. So, he was a rich man, but he was not rich enough to undertake the construction of the New River single-handed. He needed to raise additional money. And this is where the New River becomes interesting, not merely as a source of water and as a way of keeping Jacobean London alive. It's also very important in the history of business, because Hugh Middleton sold shares in what he called his venture. Now, the idea of what was known as a joint stock venture, in which shares were sold to investors, was not new in 1613. But mostly, these joint stock ventures were formed for trading voyages overseas. And lots of merchants would get together, they'd jointly invest, send ships off, bring the cargo back, sell off the cargo, take their profits, they hoped, and then take their original investment out. And each venture, Elizabethan venture, early Jacobean venture, would raise new capital for each voyage. Even the East India Company, when it was founded, it predates the New River Company, but it didn't have permanent capital. The thing about the New River was that you couldn't parcel up an aqueduct and sell bits of it off in the same way as you could sell the cargo of a ship. So the New River, as an aqueduct, needed permanent capital. And so for the first time, people agreed, as investors, to put their money in, knowing that they might never get it back, or if they were to get it back, it would be by leaving their share in place, but by selling their share. And the New River Company, I would suggest, was the very first permanent joint stock company in England, therefore probably in the world, because England led the way in these sorts of things, and as such is the forerunner of every subsequent business corporation. There were some quirks and oddities about the New River, which I'm happy to talk about later if anybody's interested, which actually made it a rather flawed model or prototype for modern business corporations. But Hugh Middleton showed the way, led the way. And as I say, he invited a number of his contemporaries in as investors, as shareholders. Here are two of them. They were, for the most part, rich London merchants and businessmen like him. The one on the right was a man called Peter Van Law, who was originally a Dutchman and was reputed to be the richest commoner in England in the reign of James I. And the one on the left was a man called John Backhouse. And he got invited to become part of the consortium or the venture because he owned the land between Islington and Clerkenwell on a hill above the city where the New River terminated. It started in Hertfordshire, flowed down to a place which became known as New River Head. And that was chosen because there was already a piece of open water. It was a duck pond. And John Backhouse owned it. And somebody obviously said, John, can we get you interested in an investor because we need your duck pond for our reservoir? And he was obviously, Backhouse, rather proud of his association with the New River because when many years later he had his portrait painted, he asked the painter to include a little landscape drawing, a little landscape painting of New River Head, and his arm is resting on it. And if I get out of the way, you might be able to see, just make out, a little painting. There is a circular reservoir, which was carved out of the rather irregularly shaped duck pond, and beside the reservoir there is what became known as the waterhouse, which was the structure in which various pipes and pumps and, not pumps, pipes and cocks and so on, taps were housed. There was one other very important shareholder, and that was this man, the King, James I. During construction, something happened to persuade some of the landowners along the route of the canal, the proposed route, to threaten to withhold their cooperation. And they were trying to get an Act of Parliament to rescind the Act of Parliament which gave Middleton the authority to build the aqueduct in the first place. And Middleton, who was obviously, quite apart from anything else, very kind of entrepreneurial, far-sighted individual, was also good at politics. He circumvented this opposition by going straight to the top. He went straight to James I and he said, I will make you an offer. And this, of course, he was speaking to a king who was desperate to find any way of financing his affairs without having to go to Parliament. He said, I'll make you an offer. If you put up half the cost of constructing this river of mine, I will give you a half share in it. And what's more, I will give you half the future profits. And James, thinking that he knew a good deal when he saw it, said, yes, okay, he'd be happy to do that. And miraculously, all the opposition from landowners melted away. And it was a very good deal because when I tell you that the New River Company became the most profitable company in British history, you will see that the Crown stood to make a great deal of money out of its 50% share. What do I mean by the most profitable company in British history? Well, A historian writing in the 1980s did some sums and worked out that if one of the original shareholders of the company had survived from all the way through from incorporation in 1619 to 1904, when the New River Company, along with the other private water companies in London, was bought out by the Metropolitan Water Board, he, and all the shareholders were, of course, men, he would have enjoyed a return on his original investment, taking into account all the dividends that the shares had paid down the years, plus the price that the Metropolitan Water Board was prepared to pay. He would have enjoyed a return on his shares of 267% per year. I defy you to find any legitimate investment, even Shell or BP, that would return you a sum that good. Unfortunately, James I's son Charles was not as clever as his father. We know that Charles made many mistakes, and one of those mistakes was to sell his stake in the New River Company back to Hugh Middleton for £500 down and £500 a year in perpetuity, thus depriving the Crown of a great deal of money. As I say, the New River runs through North London. You can see it in places. It's quite a nice walk, originally 41 miles long. It stops now at 2 reservoirs in Stoke Newington. And so, as Hilary says, you have to piece together its route south from those reservoirs as far as New River Head. And that's a picture of New River Head. You can see there the irregularly shaped original duck pond, the wall surrounding the circular reservoir and the waterhouse. That picture we know, incidentally, dates from before 1666 because that is old St Paul's Cathedral in the background, and that was destroyed in the Great Fire. And there's another picture of New River Head from the very beginning of the 18th century. You can see, by this stage, Christopher Wren's St Paul's Cathedral in the background. You can see the outer duck pond, as it was, the circular reservoir in the middle, the waterhouse. You can also see two other things of interest. Next to the original pond, you can see what looks like a windmill. And it looked like a windmill because originally it was a windmill. It was an experimental windmill with 6 sails. And it was an experiment that failed because twice in a few years, high winds blew the sails off the windmill. And so they were replaced by a horse going round and round in the base of the windmill, powering a pump, just as the sails had done. Why did the New River Company need a pump? Well, one reason why it was so profitable was because up until round about 1700, it had not needed to do any pumping. Pumping is expensive, however you do it. But the New River itself flowed by gravity from the River Lee all the way down to New River Head. And then the water from that reservoir flowed through pipes down into the City of London to the customers, again, purely by gravity. But London was expanding. London was growing westwards. And the New River Company was anxious to take advantage of this new opportunity, wanted to serve places like Soho and Covent Garden and Bloomsbury as they developed. But it discovered very quickly that the head of pressure from its original reservoir simply wasn't strong enough to send the water westwards in anything more than a trickle. So what they did was they built a second reservoir up the hill from the original one, and they installed the windmill, later the horse mill, to pump water from reservoir number 1 to reservoir number 2. And you can see that second reservoir. It's in the foreground. It's a rectangular reservoir. That too is still there. If you take the bus up Pentonville Road from King's Cross, it's on your right, it's in Claremont Square. Nowadays it's covered up, it's covered in grass, but it's still there, again, still part of London's water supply. That provided a sufficient head of pressure for customers in the West End and the opportunity for the New River Company to make even more money. Incidentally, this is a picture by an English artist. There is a very similar view by the Italian artist Canaletto who visited England, and I don't know about you, but I have always assumed, because Canaletto was such a superb draftsman, that everything he showed in his pictures must be accurate, must be what he actually saw. Not a bit of it. Canaletto looked at this and thought, that's a good view, I'll do that. But you know what? That reservoir in the foreground, it's in the wrong place. So he simply casually moved it about 200 yards west. So it's, in his version, it's in the bottom right-hand corner of the picture. And I will never trust a Canaletto picture again. The man lied. There is a photograph of New River Head taken shortly before the First World War, shortly before it disappeared. You can see the round pond, the round reservoir. You can see what the outer pond had become by this stage, which was filter beds, and you can see somewhere in that sort of gaggle of buildings on the right is the original water house, which had become buried. And all of that was swept away by the Metropolitan Water Board, which in 1920-something opened a splendid new headquarters in what is today Rosebery Avenue on that site. And the building is still there. It's posh flats now. The water companies having moved out. And virtually everything connected with the old New River Head has disappeared. However, there are one or two remains. Some of them are behind that 1920s building. If you go round the corner, you will see this funny little round building, which is the base of the original windmill or horse mill. And behind it, you can see a building that was constructed by the New River Company in the 18th century to house a steam pump. Steam power came to London initially in the water industry, and the New River Company installed a steam engine designed by the great engineer John Smeaton, and that building was constructed originally to house it, and it is the oldest surviving steam engine house in London. Steam power, of course, became ubiquitous in the 19th century, but that is the oldest surviving steam engine house, and therefore really quite important in terms of the Industrial Revolution. And the other survivor from the original New River Head is inside that 1920s building. It's this. It's a rather splendid interior, which was originally constructed in the 1680s in the old waterhouse. And it was called the courtroom, because it's where the New River Company's court of directors used to meet. Nowadays, it's called the oak room, because the panelling is made of oak. And it's really a very splendid interior. There's a very elaborate plasterwork on the ceiling. There is a painting, you can't see it in this picture, but there's a painting, a portrait on the ceiling of the king at the time, William III. And there is exquisite, very detailed carving all around the panelling, which is thought potentially, possibly, to have been by Grinling Gibbons, the great sculptor of the latter part of the 18th century, woodcarver. And it gives you some idea of what the New River Company thought of itself and how much money it had to spend by the 1680s. Joint stock companies by the end of the 17th century had become more common, but really there were only three of any importance in England at the time. One was the East India Company, one was the Bank of England, and the other was the New River Company. It was that important. What, you might be asking yourself, did Londoners do for water before the New River came along? And the answer, there are a number of answers. One was that quite a lot of them simply got water out of the River Thames. They go down to the river and they dip a bucket in. Others might have a well on their property, behind their house, in their cellar. But many in the Middle Ages and the Tudor period would have got their water from one of these. This is called a conduit house. The conduits have been laid down in the Middle Ages originally. They brought water from springs outside the walls of the City of London in narrow pipes to conduit houses, of which there were eventually 16. And you could, blocking the streets mainly, actually getting in the way of the traffic. And what you could do is queue up to get your water free of charge from one of these, or you could buy your water from one of London's water carriers. And you can see standing at the foot of that column, there's a chap with a curious kind of container over his shoulder. That was called a tankard, and there's another picture of a London water carrier with a tankard. They held 3 gallons, and these chaps went round from door to door offering water for sale. They were a rough lot, apparently. Fights used to break out between them as to who was first in the queue at the conduit, but that was where most people got their water. The problem was that between 1500 and 1600, London, the City of London, quadrupled in size. It had a population of about 50,000 in 1500, 200,000 in 1600, and there simply wasn't enough water to go around. So that was the business opportunity that Hugh Middleton spotted, but before him there was another large-scale attempt to solve London's water supply. It was called the London Bridge Waterworks. And this is a picture, two pictures, of Old London Bridge. You won't believe me, but they both show exactly the same structure. The first top one shows the medieval bridge with the houses on it, which we've come to expect. The houses were cleared away in the 18th century, and the lower picture shows what the bridge looked like in the 18th century after the houses had gone. In both pictures, you can see at the left-hand end a sort of wooden structure in the water. And that was the protective barrier around the water wheels of the London Bridge Waterworks. A German, a man, or Dutchman, a man called Peter Moritz, came to London with some sort of superior German technology, pumping technology. He installed water wheels under first one and then later several other arches of the bridge. He used the tide to turn the wheels, which drove pumps, which pumped water up from the river, and he then sold that water to customers all around the city. And he did this by laying pipes underneath the streets. And if the pipe went past your house, he was quite happy for you to connect your house up to the pipe, provided you paid him. And in the process, basically invented something which we take for granted, the modern utility company. We are all familiar with the idea of an organisation that brings, through some sort of fixed infrastructure, water, power, gas, telephones to our house and in exchange for payment. Peter Moritz and the London Bridge Waterworks invented that idea, and when the New River Company came along a few years later, Hugh Middleton borrowed that business model. The London Bridge Waterworks survived right through until Old London Bridge was demolished in 1831. This is a picture of the bridge in the 1820s. You can see at the far end, you can see the water wheels and the sort of wooden structure protecting them. You may be asking yourself, water out of the River Thames, bit mucky perhaps, and you would be right. The river was probably relatively clean in the reign of Elizabeth when the London Bridge Waterworks started. But by the 1820s, it was unquestionably, I'll come to this in more detail later, absolutely filthy. And there is evidence from a parliamentary inquiry into London's water supply in the 1820s, one of endless public inquiries. London's water became a really major political issue in the 19th century, and there were parliamentary inquiries, there were royal commissions constantly looking into it and how to improve it and so on. And one of the first in the 1820s asked the superintendent, the manager of the London Bridge Waterworks, to give evidence, and he was asked, amongst other things, about the quality of his water. And he said, people like it. They prefer it to the New River Company's water because it's softer and therefore better for doing the laundry, which actually was quite an important consideration because you need soft water to get a decent lather up, and doing the laundry was very important because it was the way people kept clean. They didn't wash themselves, but they did wash their clothes. And so, you know, he wasn't underplaying or evading the question, but his questioner said, yeah, but what about drinking it? And the chap said, I wouldn't dream of drinking it. The pipes that relayed the water of both the New River Company and the London Bridge Waterworks to customers were made of wood. Elm pipes. Elm apparently doesn't rot as easily as other woods. Bored out, laid end to end, thin end of one stuck into the thick end of the other. Mostly they were buried underground. Sometimes they appeared above ground. This is a picture of the New River Company's water mains going west across the River Fleet towards Soho and Covent Garden, and you'll not be surprised to learn that they leaked constantly. The only way actually you knew where the buried ones were was when they burst. nor were they full constantly of water, as we expect modern water mains to be. The wooden pipes would never have stood the pressure. So the water companies employed chaps like this. He's called a turncock. And it was his job to go round the streets on a regular schedule, turning on the water street by street for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours, every couple of days. And you therefore had to know the schedule, you had to know when the water in your street was likely to be on, or you had to have some sort of receptacle, some sort of barrel or cistern in which to store your water. This is a drawing of the backyard of a house in St Martin's Lane in the 1820s by a wonderful artist called George Scarfe, who was obsessive. Every day he got up and he just couldn't stop drawing. And whatever he saw, he drew. So this is his backyard. And there you can see the family water supply in that butt or barrel on the wall. There's a pipe with a tap coming into it on the top. That's the pipe from the water main in the street. That tap above would have been kept permanently open so that when the water was on in the street, you could be sure that it would fill up the butt. There's a tap at the bottom for drawing water off, for cooking, for washing and so on. And the square building in the corner is the household privy. And that was fine if you were a kind of middle-class householder. You had somewhere to store your water, somewhere to put your cistern or your water butt. Not so good if you were poor. If you were poor, you had a number of options. Many of the London parishes had parish pumps, which you could queue up at, which provided a certain amount of water. Or the landlord of your slum tenement or courtyard might install a standpipe like this and pay the local water company to supply it with water, and you would pay a little supplement on your rent to get that water. Or if you were very, very, very unlucky, your landlord would simply install a communal butt or cistern, and communal butts and cisterns in London slums became a byword for filth. People would maltreat them, mistreat them. They would wash their chamber pots in the water. Small boys would play games with the stuff. Lots of rubbish and stuff would accumulate in them. People would go to great lengths not to have to use the water from the communal system in their courtyard or their house, particularly if they were hoping to cook with it. But that was what all that many people had. Now, try and suppress the cough. The new river company's success, obviously, not surprisingly, spawned emulators, imitators, and London was also growing and growing faster than the new river company was able to supply it with water. So lots of new water companies started up. And one of them was called the Hampstead Waterworks. We know that the River Fleet rises on Hampstead Heath. That's one of the springs from which it flows. And there are lots of springs running basically down both sides of the heath. And in 1692, an enterprising group of people got together and formed the Hampstead Waterworks. And they built 2 chains of reservoirs on the Hampstead side, including what is known as the Viaduct Reservoir, and on the Highgate side, the boating pond, and just up the hill from the boating pond, the bathing ponds. And these were part of London's water supply from 1692 right through until 1855, when the Hampstead Water Company was finally bought out by the New River Company. It was never a huge success. It frequently failed to make money, even though it invested quite heavily in creating the reservoirs and expanding them from time to time. There was a moment in the very early 18th century, 1701, I think, when the New River Company was afraid that the Hampstead Company might poach customers in the West End, but the Hampstead Water Company was never I don't think it had enough water, apart from anything else. And by the time it was bought out, no domestic users were using Hampstead Waterworks water. The only people who were using it were the railway companies who needed enormous quantities of water for their steam engines, and the Metropolitan Cattle Market in Caledonian Road. But the Hampstead Waterworks is your local contribution to the history of London's water, and I thought I would point that out to you. Most of these new waterworks started up and took their water from the River Thames, which meant they had to pump it. And this is a picture of one of the newcomers. It was called the York Buildings Waterworks, started up at the very beginning of the 18th century. It's on the site of what is now Charing Cross Station and Villiers Street. And in the foreground, you can see the old watergate of the York House, the great medieval Strand mansion of the Dukes of York. That is still there. Doesn't have its feet in the water anymore, because these days it's in Embankment Gardens. They built the embankment in front of it. But York Watergate is still there. Behind it, you can see this rather striking obelisk-shaped water standpipe belonging to the waterworks. And just to the right, you can see a chimney with smoke coming out of it. I told you that the New River Company's engine house was the oldest surviving, but it wasn't the first. The very first steam engine installed in London for any purpose whatever was installed by the York Buildings Waterworks to pump water out of the Thames. It was very quickly uninstalled, in fact, because the coal bill was absolutely astronomical and they realised they couldn't afford it, so they replaced it for a time with horses. But the steam engine technology rapidly improved, and so by the end of the 18th century, more and more of London's waterworks along the Thames were employing steam engines. And here are some of them. There's the York Buildings top centre. Top left is the Lambeth Waterworks, which had an intake and pumping station where the Royal Festival Hall is now. Top right is the Southwark Waterworks, which had an intake and pumping station roughly where Southwark Bridge is now. Bottom left, and I'm sorry, some of this image has got a bit lost, is the Chelsea Waterworks, which had an intake in a reservoir linked to the River Thames by a sort of tidal canal. The reservoir was where Victoria Station is now. The canal linking it to the Thames was where the railway lines into Victoria run now, and that's not coincidental, because when the water company moved out, the railway company simply bought the land, filled in the reservoir, and built its railway station and its railway lines there. And bottom right is the pumping station of the Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks, rather later picture, the 1880s, and that is where Battersea Power Station now stands. All of these have gone, with one exception. There is one 19th century water pumping station still in existence, and it's at Brentford by Kew Bridge, and it was built for the Grand Junction Waterworks initially in the 1830s, extended in the 1850s. It has this rather splendid Italian campanile-like water standpipe, and it is now the home to the London Museum of Water and Steam. And if you want to know more about this whole subject, I cannot recommend too highly a visit to the London Museum of Water and Steam. It'll tell you lots of things about water history, and you can also look at the steam pumping engines, some of which were installed in that building when it was built, and which are still there, and in one or two cases still operate. And they are spectacular. They're enormous. They're far too big to get into a single photograph. When I started researching this book, I wasn't, frankly, terribly interested in steam. I couldn't really work out why people got excited about steam engines. Having seen and watched in operation these and other 19th century water pumping engines, I suddenly get it. They are beautiful. They're wonderful pieces of engineering. To see them in action is, they're surprisingly quiet. It's really quite awe-inspiring, and they exude sort of power. And as I say, they're also very big. In the archive at that museum, there is this photograph. This shows the biggest Cornish steam pumping engine cylinder ever made. It's lying on its side in the yard at the company who made it, which was a company called Harvey's, based in Hale in North Cornwall. And Cornwall was the centre of the steam pumping industry in Britain in the late 18th and 19th century, because it had loads of tin mines and copper mines and so on, which always were flooding. constantly in need of pumps. So they became very good at developing pumping engines in Cornwall. And this, as I say, was the biggest ever made. And I like this photograph because it says so much about Victorian Britain. First of all, it says manufacturing power and prowess. Secondly, it says world-beating, because this was made for export. It was made for a pumping station in the Netherlands. And thirdly, it says class distinction. In the middle, with his top hat and his rich coat with its fur collar, stands Old Man Harvey. On the left is a middle manager in his bowler hat. And on the right, wearing a flat cap and holding up the scale, which tells you how big this thing is the foreman. And this thing is 12 feet in diameter, 112 inches. It's absolutely enormous. Lots of money to be made in the water industry in London, so not surprisingly, the fat cats got interested. Regency businessmen launched a whole series of water companies in the 1810s, intending to take advantage of London's growth and the profits that they thought were there to be made. First of all, none of them ever made, even in the good times, profits anything like the new river companies, because they all had to pump their water up from the river. And as I said, pumping is expensive. They were also sharks. You really wouldn't want to get into business with any of these guys. And they were nowhere near as clever as they thought they were. They thought that they were smashing the monopoly of the existing water companies. And so they came along and they tried to compete directly, bless you, sir, directly with the existing water companies. We now know, thanks to partly their experience, that supplying water is basically a natural monopoly. It makes no sense for more than one company to try and supply the same street or neighbourhood. They didn't know that. So in many parts of London, 2, sometimes 3 water companies would be digging up the streets at great expense, laying pipes, trying to persuade householders to sign up with them. And the competition was fierce, in some ways extremely unpleasant. There are stories, for instance, of gangs of workmen from rival companies coming to blows in the streets. Dirty tricks abounded, one company stealing another company's customers at night by paying bribes to a householder's servants. The householders, the customers got wise, they started playing one company off against another, and the result was that none of these new companies made any money. They lost huge amounts of money. Even the New River Company, it never actually went into a loss, but its profits, its dividends fell dramatically. And so, shamefully, because they mostly had Acts of Parliament which forbid them from doing this, the companies came in 1817 north of the river and rather later south of the river to a series of secret agreements. They didn't tell the customers what they were doing. They carved the city up between them into a series of local monopolies. So you had the New River Company serving the city and North London. You had the East London Waterworks serving the East End. You had the Grand Junction Waterworks and the West Middlesex Waterworks serving West London. You had the Chelsea Waterworks serving Chelsea and Westminster. You had the Kent Waterworks in the southeast. You had the Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks all along the south bank of the Thames, and you had the Lambeth Waterworks also in South London. And those two companies were the only two which still had a significant area of overlap where they competed for customers, which was significant for a reason I'll come back to in a little while. And what did they do as soon as they'd reached these agreements? Yes, you're absolutely right. They put the prices up by 25%. And the customers were appalled because they suddenly realized that they couldn't play the companies off, one company off against another anymore. They were going to have to pay what seemed to them to be this outrageous price. And one of the things that followed was the development of a very early consumer campaign against the water companies. And this was one fruit of that campaign. This is an 1820s cartoon called John Bull's Waterworks, or Unfeeling Speculators Threatening to Cut Off One of the Necessities of Life. And basically, not to put too fine a point on it, it is a riot of cock jokes. The beefy chaps with axes are London Water Company turncocks, and they are threatening to cut off the cocks or water taps of the customers if the customers don't pay up. There's John Bull on the right, straddling his cock, saying, for God's sake, don't cut it off. There's two little boys in the background. One of them, poor little chap, has already lost his cock, and the other is about to lose his cock. And on the left, there is a lady also straddling what she describes actually as her husband's cock, trying to stop the turncock from cutting it off. Somebody asked me at one of these talks whether there was any sex in my book. And I said, this is a book about water supply. Not really, no, Sexton. And then I remembered this cartoon. And do you see how far up her leg her skirt has risen? I'm wondering whether there isn't a hint there, a suggestion that if the water company turncock were to behave kindly, he might get some little advantage. And floating in the middle of that, there is a sort of scroll, a piece of paper. And if we enlarge that, it says, Bill in Parliament to authorise certain parishes to supply themselves with water to check the extortions of the monopolising companies. And this is one of the very first manifestations of an idea which was to become more and more commonplace in the 19th century, which was that maybe, just maybe, it was not a good idea to leave something as important as the city's water supply in the hands of private, profit-making, unregulated companies. The story of London's water for most of the 19th century is of continual campaigns to get government to regulate the companies in various ways and ultimately to take them into public ownership. It took 70 years, but in 1904, as I said earlier, the Metropolitan Water Board came into being and took over what were by then the 8 private water companies. There was another complaint that this consumer campaign raised, and that was quality. This is the frontispiece of a pamphlet called The Dolphin, or Grand Junction Nuisance, also from the 1820s. A dolphin, I didn't know this until I started researching the book, is a wooden structure in water which is there to protect something. And the dolphin in this case is the thing that looks a bit like an octagonal garden shed sitting in the river. And it's there to protect the intake pipe of the Grand Junction Waterworks. And the Waterworks pumping station is on the bank there with its smoking chimney. This is not the one that is now the museum. That's further upriver. This was an earlier one. And on the left, this is at Chelsea. You can see Chelsea Hospital, which is obviously still there. And in between the two, you can see a channel. That was the Ranelagh Sewer. And the author of the pamphlet pointed out, quite correctly, that the water company's intake was at the mouth of the sewer. And therefore, anything that came down the sewer was likely to get sucked into the intake and distributed to the Grand Junction Waterworks customers. As a result, the author of the pamphlet suggested customers were being offered a fluid saturated with the impurities of 50,000 houses, a dilute solution of animal and vegetable substances in a state of putrefaction, alike offensive to the sight, disgusting to the imagination, and destructive to health. And he wasn't wrong. And it wasn't only the Grand Junction Waterworks, because the whole of the Thames in central London was a sewer. Some clever chap had invented the flushing water closet. And instead of household ordure going into a pit, a cesspit, underneath or behind your house, which periodically was dug out by night soil men who'd load the stuff onto carts and take it out to the farms and market gardens around the outskirts and use it as fertilizer, instead of that, those cesspits would have filled up with water in no time with flushing water closets. So the effluent was diverted into the existing sewers, and the sewers just, which had been designed purely to take rainwater runoff, emptied straight into the Thames. And the Thames in central London became a huge cesspool, and because the Thames is tidal, the stuff never went away. It would start to go downriver on the outgoing tide, but then on the incoming tide, it would come back up. And there are stories of people living beside the river who would watch the same dead dog floating back and forth for several days. And the scientists got interested, and they too demonstrated that, yes, this water was absolutely filthy. These are some sort of illustrations of slides prepared by looking through a microscope in 1851 by a man called Arthur Hassel, who analysed the water being supplied by all the London water companies and concluded that according to the present system of London's water supply, a portion of the inhabitants of the metropolis are made to consume a portion of their own excrement and moreover to pay for the privilege. And he deduced that there was excrement there because, as well as all sorts of animalcules, and we would call them bacteria and so on, he noticed lots of things like half-digested muscle fibres that he concluded could only have got into the water by way of the human gut. And the cartoonist got onto this one as well. This is monster soup, commonly called Thames water. And there's a lady looking through a microscope at all the sort of dreadful, nasty beasties in the water. And do you see, she has been drinking a cup of tea, but her cup has fallen from her nerveless fingers now that she realises what is in the water. And the general public quickly formed the view that there was something really unpleasant in London's water. Here is a cartoon from the 1840s called Mistaking Cause for Effect. This is one of those water company turncocks, and he's on his rounds, and there are two little boys watching him, and one of them is saying, "I say, Tommy, I'm blowed if there's not, can't read it, I'm blowed if there isn't a man a-turning on the cholera." And the interesting thing about this is that in the 1840s, the scientists did not believe and would not accept that cholera was a waterborne disease. We now know it is. But the general public, and this is not the only example of a cartoon like this which shows ordinary members of the public equating dirty water with cholera, ordinary members of the public put two and two together and thought there was a very strong likelihood that the water was giving them cholera, and they weren't happy about that. The man who established, beyond peradventure, that cholera is a waterborne disease, I write about him in the book, he's one of my heroes, he's Dr. John Snow. And many of you may know this story. There was a cholera outbreak in London in 1854, and there was a particularly severe set of cases in Soho, close to where Snow lived, and he was intrigued, he went to investigate, and he inquired as to where people had died of cholera, and he plotted the houses in which they died on a map and established that the deaths clustered around one particular street called Broad Street, which is now Broadwick Street in the middle of Soho. And he found there was a pump in Broadwick Street, and he got the local authority, the parish, to take the handle off the pump, and the outbreak of cholera stopped. It's a great story. It's not probably entirely true, I'm afraid. It's not quite accurate for reasons that I go into in the book. But Snow was unquestionably a pioneer of epidemiology, and what's more, following that same outbreak, 1854 outbreak, he did another piece of work, not in Soho, but south of the river, where there was also a lot of cholera, and where you will recall was the only part of London where two water companies served the same district. So you could have houses identical in every other respect, next door to one another. One got water from one company, the other got water from another. And he established that in households served by the Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks Company, deaths from cholera were 10 times higher than deaths from cholera in households which took their water from the Lambeth Waterworks. Why? Well, because a couple of years earlier, the Lambeth Waterworks had moved its intake. Its chief engineer, who's another hero of my book, a man called James Simpson, concluded that there was no way his company could purify the water that it was getting out of the tidal Thames. You'll remember from where the Festival Hall now is. So he persuaded his directors to build a new intake upstream from Teddington Lock near Kingston at a place called Seething Wells, where the water was much, much cleaner. And by 1854, the cholera outbreak, South Londoners getting Lambeth water were getting clean water. South Londoners taking Southwark and Vauxhall water were getting water from Battersea, which had cholera in it. 1852 was the year that South London Waterworks, Lambeth Waterworks opened upstream. It was also the year that finally, reluctantly, the government was persuaded to legislate. It passed something called the Metropolis Water Act in 1852 and followed where James Simpson had led. It decreed that any company getting its water out of the tidal Thames or the tidal River Lee had to move its intake upstream from the tidal area. It also had to do something else. It had to filter its water. And James Simpson was responsible for that too. James Simpson in the 1820s was the first person in the London water industry to install what were known as slow sand filters to purify the water. Here is a picture of Hampton Waterworks in the 1890s. Several of the water companies moved their intakes and their rather splendid pumping stations upstream to Hampton after this legislation, and there they installed filter beds, and the legislation said every water company had to filter its water. Here is one of those slow sand filter beds, which is actually being cleaned, which is why it's empty of water. And slow sand filter beds are very simple. You lay down a layer of gravel and then coarse sand, then fine sand. You allow water to flood on to the top of this surface and trickle slowly down through, and then you have pipes at the bottom to take the water away. And in this process, the water is almost miraculously cleansed. Simpson and his contemporaries thought that these slow sand filters just worked like mechanically. They were great big strainers, and they took the bits out. What we now know, actually, is that they work biologically, because on the top of the sand there forms something with the rather delightful German name of a Schmutzdecke, which means slime blanket. Basically, it is a layer of good bugs that eat all the bad bugs in the raw water coming out of the river. And what comes out at the bottom is 98% clear, pure. Remarkable. Just very briefly, there was one other important piece of 19th century legislation before the water companies were taken into public ownership in 1904. That was in 1871, a Metropolis Water Act, which established the first water regulators. There was a water examiner, Major, later Colonel Sir Frank Bolton, whose job was to monitor the quality of the water that the companies were providing. He didn't do a terribly good job, actually. I think he was probably as the subject of sort of what we would call regulatory capture. He got too close to the water industry. And the other man, seen there in extreme old age, cradling his grandson at his christening, was a man called Alan Stoneham, who was appointed the first government auditor of the water companies to ensure that they followed honest accounting principles and did not rip off either their customers or their shareholders. And Stoneham was, unlike Bolton, I think, very successful, did a good thing. And they were the forerunners of today's water regulators, like the Environment Agency and Ofwat and the Drinking Water Inspectorate, because having taken our water into public ownership in 1989, we privatized it again. And we are now painfully relearning all the lessons that the Victorians learned about why private ownership of such an important public resource as water and nowadays sewerage is a very bad idea. And there's a chapter about that in the book, and I can tell you why, if you're really interested, why I think the Environment Agency and Ofwat in particular have failed so dramatically, but failed they have. But that's enough from me. There is the cover of the book. I am happy to take some questions, and there we are.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there will be some questions. So who's going to start?
Gentleman at the back.
Good evening. Thanks very much. That was fascinating. In the period before drinking water could be was certain to be clean, were most people drinking small beer? So were they not drinking water? They were drinking things other than water?
A lot of them were, yes. In the Middle Ages and the sort of 17th century, people brewed beer, and the process of brewing beer eliminated a lot of the danger, actually, in the water. Not everybody did. Some people drank water, but mostly they would adulterate it with something, partly because it tasted so vile, so you might drink gin and water or something like that. The fact that so many people drank beer rather than drink the water offended 19th century moralists. And one of the sort of motivating forces of the public health campaign, which was very concerned with pioneering public health campaigners, very concerned with water quality, was to try and get the poor off beer onto water, because they thought the beer was doing them no good, they were wasting their money and all that sort of thing. And they much preferred tea, which is also, of course, a good way of purifying water, because you boil the water, it gets rid of most of the bugs. Unfortunately, tea is nowhere near as nutritious as beer, so people's nutrition suffered with the switch from beer to tea. But yeah, people, almost nobody, only the poor and the very desperate drank water neat. Wait until the mic comes, please.
How did the first water company charge their customers, or assume they didn't have meters?
No, they didn't have meters. And meters, in fact, in domestic supply are really very recent. They charged a rate, an annual rate, much like the local government rate that preceded the council tax, and it was based on the size of your house. So big house, high rate, small house, low rate. The rating system was very confusing, because the water company's rating system was different from the parishes and later the borough council's rating system. It was very arbitrary. It was often done on the basis simply of counting the number of windows. You know, you've got 8 windows, you big house, you charge you a lot. You've only got 4 windows, smaller house will charge you much less. But that was how it was done. It was a very, and the rates were collected twice a year, every 6 months, by collectors who went round door to door. Dickens has a water rates collector in one of his novels, Nicholas Nickleby, I think, who is a subject of great envy is not the right word, but his relatives think very highly of him, because they're all hoping to inherit his riches. And if you were a successful water rate collector, you could do very well indeed. You could make a lot of money. It was all done on commission.
That was absolutely wonderful. Who was responsible for the quality of water actually in the Thames itself? And were the companies, did they pay the government, or?
They paid the Thames Conservancy, which has had various iterations, and forgive me, I can't remember the details, but there was a body which was run by the City of London, and which spawned what we now know, or what became the Thames Conservancy, which is now, I think, part of Natural England, and also the Port of London Authority. And that was responsible for the river, for the sort of maintenance of the river, for structures on the river, but it wasn't remotely interested in cleanliness. Because the companies were taking water out of the river, they did pay, not huge amounts, but they did pay a certain amount of money. And the East London Waterworks, which got its water from the River Lee, and the New River Company paid the River Lee's equivalent body, which I think was called, you'll be surprised to learn, the River Lee Conservators. But quality, cleanliness, nothing to do with them, Gov. And the water companies were very cynical about it. The New River Company was in a very favourable position, because its intake on the Lee was really quite a long way upstream, but it was still downstream from Hertford, which is a sizable town, which had sewers that emptied into the Lee. And so the New River Company paid to build a sewer, which took all Hertford sewage down past the New River Company intake and put it into the Lee downstream. And at one of these public inquiries, somebody said to the chief engineer of the New River Company, doesn't that mean, though, that the East London Waterworks, which has an intake lower down, won't they catch all the sewage? And his reply was basically, well, that's their problem, it's not mine. Yeah, but I grew very cynical about Victorian business as a result of... yes, lady in the front here.
Hello, thank you. That was very, very interesting. A couple of things. One, can you talk about Bazalgette? Because I had thought that cholera in France and the transformation of Paris under Baron Hauffmann had caused Bazalgette to make the changes here in London inside the sewage system. How much did he play a part in water? And do these areas of water also, do we find them in the London parks he built over the sewage system? And the other little question is, obviously there are themes that you're talking about with sewage and that are reflected in certain things going on today.
Okay.
How do you feel about drinking the water we have today in London?
Drinking water in London today is okay. The Drinking Water Inspectorate, which monitors the quality of water, does, at the current regulators, does seem to do a perfectly decent job, and the companies are perfectly good at purifying it and so on. The problems with today's water companies are the result of decades of underinvestment, as a result of which there are huge amounts of leaks from mains and water pipes and so on, and the sewage treatment works are simply not big enough, and if you've been following this, it's become a real cause célèbre at the moment. Enormous quantities of untreated sewage are allowed routinely to go onto beaches and into rivers and watercourses, and that's illegal, actually. The water companies, in many cases, have been breaking the law, and yet they seem to have suffered virtually. That's not true. Some of them have suffered quite significant penalties. But that is a problem which results from privatisation. There certainly seems to be huge parallels. There are, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Water was privatised in 1989 because the government believed, I think correctly, that there was no way the necessary investment, which even then it was clear there was a lot of backlog of investment which needed to be done. There was no chance that government was prepared, remember this is the 1980s, government would be prepared to sanction the necessary investment. So let's privatise them and get the private sector to come up with the money. And for about 10 years, actually, through the 1990s, it worked quite well. And what then happened was that the water company shareholders, many of which came in after the initial privatisation, were foreign utility companies, were foreign sovereign wealth funds, dreadful, rapacious people, started to game the system. They realised that they were cleverer than the regulator, that they could take money in dividends out of the system, and that it wasn't necessary for them to spend as much money as they really should on investment. And the figure that's in the book, it's changed since, but not materially. The figure in the book which really struck me was that in 1989, and we're talking here not just about London, but the whole of the UK's water companies were privatised with no debts. The government wrote off their debts. By 2019, they had collectively run up debts of £53 billion. If they had borrowed all that money in order to invest in improving their infrastructure, no one would have a problem with that. But against that 53 billion in borrowings, they had paid themselves 56 billion in dividends. And that, I'm afraid, is a terrible failure on the part of Ofwat, the regulator, which was supposed to stop that. And the Environment Agency is supposed to stop the sewage discharges, but is hopelessly understaffed and under-resourced and not able to do the job properly. Just go back. Bazalgette, Joseph Bazalgette installed the system of intercepting sewers that eventually kept sewage out of the Thames and sent it downstream to Barking and Crossness on the South Bank. Didn't do anything with it, just moved the problem downstream. So enormous quantities of 19th century untreated sewage were being pumped into the water. It was just downstream from where most Londoners could see it. And the money for that project was approved by government in 1858 after what was known as the Great Stink, hottest summer on record. The Thames became absolutely intolerable, it stank, and everybody was appalled and people fainted and all the rest of it. And the government, which of course Westminster right by the river, finally sanctioned borrowing by what was called the Metropolitan Board of Works, for which Bazalgette was the chief engineer. I don't think the model was Paris. I think it was a homegrown plan which, in fact, Bazalgette hadn't drawn up. His boss at the Metropolitan Board of Works had drawn the plan up, a man called Foster, and Foster died, and Bazalgette inherited the plan and made it happen, which, you know, it's one thing having the plan, it's another actually putting it into practice. And Bazalgette, you know, deserves a great deal of credit for that. But I'm not conscious that that what was happening in France was a factor there. It was just... Cholera, the thing about John Snow was that he demonstrated the link between cholera and water. He died in 1858 or 59, and at the time of his death, the scientific community still would not accept his findings. To us, it seems bloody obvious, and he had the statistical evidence, the epidemiological evidence, but the scientific community, they laughed at him. They thought he's gone down the drains, he's gone mad, you know, this is nonsense. It wasn't until the 1860s, after the project to reconstruct the sewers was well underway, that the scientific community finally said to themselves, hang on a minute, do you know what, maybe Snow was right. Maybe cholera is in the water, and if we clean up the water, maybe we can get rid of the cholera, which they eventually did, and cholera disappeared. Last outbreak was 1866.
I think we should stop there.
Well,
I think we
there's
should...
at least one more. Let the gentleman.
Well, Simon, you wanted one, yes? You're okay. Very
quick one. My answers are too long.
Right. I live in a very hard water area, and it was treated years ago with something called sodium something or other. The technician that comes along and pours this stuff in said, I would never drink this under any circumstances. He would only drink bottled water.
Yeah, I can't possibly comment. I don't know enough about that. I do know that my parents, my father in Abingdon, artificially softens his water, but has a little tap which is delivering unsoftened water for drinking, because the softened water does have a very peculiar taste.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. I'm glad to see that the mixture of white wine and water worked wonderfully well.
Yes.
That was
the voice just about held out.
Really terrific talk. And you have told us all the things that we're not going to discover without buying your book. So I think we must go next door now and do exactly that. Come next door, please, and have a glass of wine and talk a little bit more to Nick.
And we we take cash or card. Thank you very much.